Okay, colleagues, so hello and welcome back. This is going to be a short video about freedom. Specifically, I want to give a brief overview of the problem of the freedom of the will, and more importantly, to give you my opinion to advance several arguments against the strong so-called libertarian understanding of the ontological reality of the freedom of the human will. And I want to argue in favor of compatibilism. So to speak loosely, my point in this video is going to be that even though there is no such thing as free will, strictly speaking, there is a certain way of talking, of using the word freedom, which still makes sense, even on the assumption of determinism. So to state the conclusion, my point is that to be free, in a meaningful sense, can only mean to be determined by the, so to speak, right kinds of causes. That is to say, internal, non-pathological, psychological causes. Okay, so that's the conclusion. Let's jump into the fray. Now, since I want to be brief and paint in broad strokes, so to speak, I will not go into a lot of detail. And although I do not really expect to provide knockdown arguments, to convince everyone, so to speak, partly because this is intended indeed only as a brief video, but still, I do want to show a basic plausibility of the position that I'm trying to defend. So freedom is really one of those perennial philosophical questions. Questions that philosophers have basically debated since the beginning of philosophy, more or less. And especially because of its connection to the question of justice and responsibility, the topic of freedom tends to arouse really strong emotions. And I feel that there's, in general, a certain cultural prejudice, according to which freedom is really necessary to make sense of our moral worldview or outlook. Again, many first-year students find it completely implausible and fantastical to imagine that you could have a philosophical system denying free will seriously, so to speak. So I would probably start off by saying that certain versions of determinism have likely existed since really ancient times. So again, without going into detail, certain ideas of ancient pre-Socratic philosophers, or the Buddhist idea of non-self, anatman, or the position that Socrates takes in the dialogue Gorgias, where Socrates says that no one does wrong willingly. So all of these could, maybe somewhat controversially, but still could be interpreted as, broadly speaking, supporting some form of determinism and denying the strong ontological formulation of the free will, libertarian free will, as it is sometimes called. So again, maybe to be somewhat more explicit, my own position is that of a determinist, the idea being that the laws of the universe determine the course of every event, including human decision-making, to a complete exceptionless extent, whereas the position that I am attacking, that of the so-called libertarian free will, assumes that somehow human beings, through one mechanism or another, are free to initiate new causal chains, such that the responsibility for one's action lies entirely with one's act of uncaused choice. An instance of maybe something like creation ex nihilo, so creation from nothing. Okay, this is a bit of a sidetrack, but let me just mention that I think that the popularity of this libertarian view of free will, it seems to me, really stems from the legacy of the Abrahamic religions, that is, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in the popular versions of which God, Allah, or Yahweh, judges and damns sinners for all eternity. And in order to make this picture consistent, for God to be truly just, the actions for which people are punished with eternal damnation have to be entirely due to them. Otherwise, this act of damnation would simply appear as an act of arbitrary violence or something like that. Okay, now let me talk in a broad sense about why I actually find the libertarian view of free will deeply implausible. So, first of all, I think it is a deep and necessary feature of any rational account of the universe that we do not appeal to miracles in our explanations. Which is to say that for methodological reasons, we assume that every event has a regular identifiable cause. In physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, basically in all of the sciences, this is a very important, I would say, a foundational assumption. And if, for example, we see something in the experiment or encounter something in the experience more generally, something that seems to be inexplicable, we do not normally assume that this singular event is somehow a violation of the regularity of nature. In other words, we do not assume that it is a supernatural miracle. But what we actually assume is we assume that we need a better or a deeper explanation. So to take a very straightforward example, in the ancient times, solar eclipses might have seen as something completely arbitrary and unpredictable, and therefore attributable to an arbitrary free will of a god. So let's say, why has the sun gone black? Well, maybe Zeus is angry at some particular transgression. But at some point, the ancient astronomers have learned to predict these events, and later it was understood that the eclipse is due to the peculiarity of the motions of the celestial objects, and not to some kind of divine arbitrary will. So the strong contention that I am trying to make is that all of science progresses according to this rule. We never assume that something is due to a miracle. We always assume that everything has an explanation, and we try to push our understanding as far as possible. And this is a general methodological premise which has yielded spectacular results in the past. Now, one could plausibly imagine that for any currently unsolved mystery in science, we would never have a solution. And therefore, it is imaginable that miracles do happen. But I think it's also quite clear that even though it's possible to imagine miracles happening, I do not think that it is possible to prove that miracles do happen. Because again, think for 5 seconds, what would that involve? What would that require? The only way I can know that something is really a miracle is only if somehow I am able to rule out all possible natural explanations. But how can one do that? Maybe this particular allegedly miraculous event is simply due to some undiscovered bit of physics. Like, I'm sure electricity and electromagnetism seemed miraculous to people before those phenomena became understood. So when we see a seemingly miraculous event, how do we know it's not due to some undiscovered, law-like, predictable, regular force of nature? It's a little bit like trying to prove a non-existence of unicorns. Think about this, again, logically speaking. Can you prove that unicorns don't exist? Maybe you haven't looked hard enough. Maybe they exist on another planet. Like, it's one thing to say that there is no rational reason to believe in the existence of unicorns. It is a very different thing to say that we have proven that unicorns do not exist. So to drive this point home, in terms of human behavior, I think methodologically we have to assume that human behavior is not miraculous, but that it is very much explicable. And we need to try to push the science of physiology, neurobiology, psychology, etc., as far as we can, without assuming in advance that they are doomed to failure. Okay, but all of these considerations are, so to speak, on the negative side, saying that we should not assume that human behavior is in principle inexplicable. But what about the positive side? How hard is it actually to predict human behavior? And are we making any progress? And again, let me begin by saying that since ancient times, I think everybody understood that human behavior is actually fairly predictable. Like, for example, if you punch somebody in the face, the person tends to get upset and angry. Or if people go without food or water for a long time, they tend to get hungry and thirsty. And hunger and thirst also results in fairly predictable patterns of behavior. We know what a hungry person looks like, broadly speaking. Wine and other forms of alcohol tends to have predictable effect. And the list could continue on and on and on. Think about the regular interactions that we have in society. Like you walk into a store to buy something, or you ride a taxi, or you take a metro. Again, the vast majority of people you encounter tend to behave in highly predictable fashion. If human beings were really ontologically free to do completely whatever, the degree of social order that we can actually see around us would really be hard to imagine. So we see this extraordinary degree of predictability in the normal course of events. But take the extraordinary. Take extreme circumstances or take violent crime. Again, imagine people rushing out of a building on fire. It's quite possible to study and to model this kind of behavior. Indeed, there are whole branches of engineering science devoted precisely to understanding human behavior in extreme circumstances, so as to, for example, design fire escapes in a more efficient fashion. Or again, take violent crime. Even though individual cases of crime may be harder to explain, but the overall social patterns of crime tend to be highly regular, highly predictable, similar from year to year. The correlations between, let's say, gender, social economic background, and other observable factors actually allows the social scientists to make quite a bit of sense of the statistics of crime. But even more than that, think about crime and punishment in general. Why do we punish people? Why do we send them to prison? Fine them, or in extreme circumstances, especially in the past, torture or even kill criminals or delinquents? Surely nobody would deny that, at least to some extent, punishment is supposed to have a deterrent effect. Punishment is supposed to prevent crime. But notice, how can punishment prevent crime? I mean, if human beings are like machines, like mechanisms, let's say human beings have something like a utility function. They're trying to maximize pleasure in some sense and trying to avoid pain. And in a quasi-mechanical fashion, they perform something like a calculation in their brain. It's obviously an oversimplified picture, but let's stick with it for the moment. If that were the case, so if on some level, to some extent, human beings were machines, then indeed the threat of punishment could, so to speak, push the right buttons in a person's head and make them less likely to commit a particular crime. Whereas on the strong libertarian view, if people are really free, then it is unclear how punishment could have any effect at all. And let's forget about criminals for a second. In general, all of our social life is to a very large extent organized around a system of rewards and punishments. Punishments for lateness or inattention, rewards for enthusiasm, honesty, pro-social behavior, job well done. The only reason why these rewards and punishments could be effective is only if human behavior is indeed a result of some, broadly speaking, deterministic process. And so, if I could go back to the questions of responsibility, let's first ask ourselves, if human beings are, broadly speaking, determined by something like internal psychological mechanisms, do we need the word freedom at all? And I want to say yes. So even though I methodologically assume that all events in the universe are a result of an inexorable unfolding of the exceptionalist laws of nature, still, there are different kinds of causes. So imagine some silly example. You take me, take my conscious, alive, awake body, and throw it out the window. And I land on someone and I kill them. Is it my fault? No. Why? because, broadly speaking, the death of this unfortunate bystander under my window was not a result of my internal psychological conscious decision. So to imagine an opposite example, let's say I look at an innocent bystander under my window, and I have, for a particular reason, formed an intention to kill the bystander by jumping out of the window on top of them. Now, in the latter case, I am to blame. So what I'm trying to illustrate by these two examples is precisely this position which is known as compatibilism. That even though determinism is true, there is still a meaningful way to talk about human freedom in the following sense. To be free is not to be free from the laws of nature. That seems to be impossible. To be free is simply to be determined by the right kinds of causes, namely proper internal, non-pathological, psychological causes. Something that people usually call character, let's say. And I mean, as a matter of fact, and as a matter of observation, the regularity of our lives relies on the fact that the vast majority of normal human beings do have stable character traits, which allows to both predict their behavior and to modify their behavior in a regular fashion. So I could go on talking about this for a very long time indeed, but let me try to wrap this up. Now, what I try to argue is that for methodological reasons, we should not assume that human beings have anything like this strong formulation of the libertarian free will. Because to assume that is basically to rely on miracles as explanations, and that is bad form. But on the other hand, the opposite assumption, that human beings are akin to machines, that human behavior is a result of a broadly speaking regular and a broadly speaking predictable mechanism. That assumption indeed underlies all of our social life, including such important institutions as rewards and punishments, both in the legal sense and in the everyday colloquial sense. Now, a couple of caveats. Of course, when I say that human behavior is broadly speaking predictable, I don't mean that we can actually predict with 100% accuracy what any given person would do in the next moment. The human brain is an incredibly complex system. I think the current estimate is that there's 100 billion neurons in the brain and maybe something like 100 trillion connections. So, simply because of its sheer complexity, the operation of the brain is extremely difficult to both understand and model, and therefore predict with high degree of precision. I think it's fair to say, although physicists may correct me on that human brain, in this sense, is a more complicated system than the Milky Way galaxy. But, rather amazingly, especially given this astronomical complexity of the human brain, I should say beyond astronomical. So what I'm saying is that we should probably be amazed how predictable human behavior is given the complexity of the brain. And the second caveat is a general philosophical point. That of course the problem of free will is indeed ancient and highly volatile. So that the smartest people, the smartest philosophers in all of human history have tried to come up with the best arguments on both sides of the issue. So I am not really expecting anyone to simply buy the story I am trying to tell in this short video. As the saying goes, clever people do not necessarily hold right opinions, but clever people always find intricate reasons in support of whichever opinion they happen to hold. I mean, in general, in the history of philosophy, it's not hard to find some brilliant philosopher of the past defending any view whatsoever with great passion and often with excellent sounding arguments. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the following. I do think that the view that I'm trying to advance in this video, the compatibilist view, I think that it makes the most sense given everything that we think we know about the world. But if the listener is not satisfied with the arguments I've given here, so much the better. After all, the proper philosophical procedure is to examine the best arguments on the both sides of the issue, and only then provisionally accepting some form of a tentative conclusion. So if you take this video as an invitation to investigate this topic further, I think I can consider my job well done. But in any case, I hope I was able to convince the listener that there is a certain basic plausibility behind the compatibilist worldview. And I guess we can continue this discussion from there. So, I hope that the video has given you some food for thought, and I hope to see you next time. And until then, take care.